All right, so after reading chapter 15, 16, and the epilogue of this book, something that I would like to point out is in chapter 15, which is the second golden hour of trauma. So it says, it's like the first paragraph, it says, some diseases cannot pass from person to person without a vector. Whether it be the mosquito or the bullet, to carry it from one person to the next human host. In America, violence, not malaria, is endemic. Guns are a prominent and potent vector for violence, unlike in other parts of the world. Lavanell Lee Henderson never sought to return violence upon his younger brother Ronald, who had shot him in the leg. People like Lee, who have learned to work out differences and find nonviolent ways to resolve a conflict, are less likely to perpetrate this cycle of violence. So I think this specific chapter is so important. Right here it says, in the decade that followed, homicides reached more than half. How did the Violence Reduction Unit accomplish this goal? Gang members who were responsible for much of the violence were actively engaged and provided alternatives such as youth clubs, trainings, and work. Surgeons who bore witness to the carnage used their anecdotal experience to inform research. Science ultimately informed policies such as increasing prices on alcoholic beverages to reduce the likelihood of excessive consumption. Alcohol, which has been associated with a large portion of patients seeking care for assault as well as with the perpetrators of those crimes, became a target for decision makers working to reduce violence. Authorities use schools to educate young people about bullying and the day-to-day actions that can undertake to prevent escalation to violent confrontation. None of these actions require regulatory or legislative activities limiting access to firearms. In fact, guns were not even the problem in Scotland. The most common weapons were knives. Like guns, knives were merely a vector in the transmission of the disease. Using a public health approach to address violence, the researchers successfully reduced harm among youth in their community. These were lessons adopted from colleagues in Boston, Massachusetts, a similarly sized city, which housed a 1990s program known as Operation Ceasefire. Operation Ceasefire began in Boston to address youth homicides, which had been rising in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The city averaged over 40 youth homicides annually prior to the initiation of the program. But after Operation Ceasefire had been in operation for 2 years, youth homicides decreased to only 10 per year, a 70% reduction in fatalities. However, once the program ended, youth homicides began to rise again, eventually surpassing the previous annual average. So I think that in itself is so important. And I say that because youth violence is something that's so big, and it's still big to this day. And I think that we don't really pay enough attention to it. That's why, you take, for example, the Oxford shooting, or, let's see what else, the Parkland shooting, along those lines. A quote that was particularly, that made the greatest impact, was in chapter 16, right here. It says, concealed carry laws differ in several distinct ways, ranging in order of least to the most restrictive, from permitless carry to shall issue to may issue laws. Among the states that require a permit for someone to carry a concealed weapon, the permitting entity, often law enforcement, must issue it to anyone who meets minimum standards and shall issue states. In may issue states, There is some additional leeway for the law enforcement to prevent issuing a permit to people who might be a threat to themselves or others, even even if they otherwise would be eligible by virtue of the fact that they are not a felon, or not subject to a mental health restriction, or are not a convicted domestic abuser. And so I think that's such an important thing. What are your primary takeaways now that you have read the entire book? Did reading the book change your perspectives and or identify any misconceptions you may have previously had about gun violence? I think personally, from someone who is always actively researching, works in the healthcare field, works strictly with the emergency department now, we see a lot of issues like gun violence in itself, and I think personally that it has changed, like, my perspective, and I think a lot of it had to do with seeing it firsthand, essentially. Granted, I have never been in an active shooter situation, but I have seen, like, gunshot victims and things along those lines, and I think it's so important that we take gun violence so seriously. Even though it may not seem like a serious thing, it's a very serious thing, and a lot of it starts with background checks and mental health checks. And I think once we do more diligence in that area, we'll tend to we'll try and bring the amount of gun violence down.